In one of the poorest nations on earth, where natural wealth was drained for decades and the future seemed like nothing but a shadow, a 34-year-old man stood up and became president. He wasn't born into the elite. He didn't inherit power. He never studied economics at a prestigious foreign university. Yet within just 2 short years, he set in motion changes that stunned his people, sparking economic growth, reducing public debt, and, perhaps most importantly, reigniting a hope that had long been extinguished. The people began to call him the new flame of the African continent. To many, he became living proof that integrity and courage could carve a turning point in a nation's destiny. And today you'll understand why this young, unassuming man became more than a head of state. He became the embodiment of Africa's longing for dignity and independence. From a forgotten student of geology at the University of Ouagadougou to a leader whose voice now shakes the halls of power across Africa, Ibrahim Traoré was never the kind of man people noticed when he walked by. He didn't shine with privilege or fame. He blended into the crowd. But behind that quiet presence, a fire was growing, a burning will to see his people free, to see his country stand tall, to see Burkina Faso not as a pawn, but as its own master. He was born in the small town of Bondokui, where the simplest things, electric light, medicine, or a paved road to school, were luxuries. As a boy, he watched children abandon classrooms because hunger drove them away. He heard the weary sighs of mothers, carrying the weight of entire families on the meager profit of vegetables sold in dusty markets. Those memories scarred him, but they also shaped him, and that is why he chose the army, not to chase medals, not to wield power, but to stand closer to reality, to see the hardship firsthand, and to prepare himself for change. When Burkina Faso faced its darkest hour, he didn't rise with grand speeches or thunderous declarations. He stood up quietly but firmly, declaring that his country could no longer live in chains, that the nation's destiny must belong only to its people. At the Russia-Africa Summit in 2023, Ibrahim Traoré stepped onto the stage, and the entire world was forced to listen. He didn't arrive wrapped in prestige or wearing a golden crown of diplomacy. He arrived with the truth. He declared, "We have gold, we have diamonds, we have oil, yet we remain the poorest continent on earth. That is no coincidence." And the room went silent. Not because he shouted, not because he attacked, but because his words sliced through decades of silence. For too long, Africa had played the role of the puppet, dancing to the strings of others. For too long, leaders had pretended not to notice the obvious truth, that their nations bled wealth while their people lived in poverty. But here was a young man, with no foreign pedigree, no elite blessing, speaking the words that generations had swallowed in fear. It wasn't anger that shook the audience. It was recognition. It was honesty. It was the undeniable fact that Africa had been robbed in plain sight, and nobody had dared to say it out loud at such a stage. From that day, Ibrahim Traoré was no longer just the captain turned president of a small West African nation. He became one of the few voices capable of reigniting the dream of freedom across an entire continent. He was no longer speaking only for Burkina Faso. He was speaking for Africa itself. In Africa, there exists a chain. It is not made of iron, it is made of paper. That chain is called the CFA franc, a currency printed in France, forced upon 14 African nations. To the outside world, it looks like money, but hidden within it is a system of control. Every nation that uses this currency is required to deposit half of its foreign reserves into the French treasury. Imagine that. Africa creates the wealth, but the right to keep it rests in the hands of someone else. Burkina Faso was trapped in this cycle. Its gold, its cotton, its resources left the country in ships and airplanes. Yet its people remained poor, scraping by without the basics of a decent life. But when Ibrahim Traoré came to power, he refused to let history repeat itself. He made a bold move to create a national central bank and to issue a currency owned, printed, and controlled by the people of Burkina Faso themselves. To him, independence was not a slogan. It was not a line in a dusty constitution. Independence meant control of your wealth, control of your resources, and control of your future. And his rebellion didn't stop with money. For years, French troops stood on Burkinabe soil under the banner of security assistance. Yet insecurity remained. Terror attacks still struck villages. Families still fled their homes. So Traoré made another daring choice. He ended the foreign military presence. He told the world that Burkina Faso would defend itself, build its own army, and no longer rely on outside powers to protect its people. It was a decision that electrified the streets. Thousands poured out carrying the Burkinabe flag, not because a politician told them to, but because they felt for the first time in decades that their country was truly theirs again. This wasn't just a political act. It was a signal of a new era, an Africa beginning to speak in its own voice. And the ripples spread across the Sahel. Mali, Niger, and others began to look at Burkina Faso not as a struggling neighbor, but as a model of courage, a reminder that liberation is possible. Ibrahim Traoré understood a simple but powerful truth. If a nation cannot feed itself, it cannot call itself free. For too long, Burkina Faso exported raw gold while importing finished products. Farmers grew tomatoes, yet the nation imported tomato paste from Europe. Crops were harvested, but the profits disappeared overseas. Traoré decided this cycle had to end. He ordered the construction of a gold refinery inside Burkina Faso. From now on, the nation's gold would be processed at home, creating jobs for Burkinabe workers, adding value to the national economy, and keeping wealth within the country. But it wasn't just about gold. When he learned that farmers grew thousands of tons of tomatoes, while shops still relied on European imports, he built a tomato processing plant in-country. The message was clear. What Burkinabe hands grow, Burkinabe mouths should eat. Infrastructure, too, was reimagined. For decades, foreign contractors had quoted outrageous prices for building roads, sometimes higher than in developed countries. Traoré rejected this dependency. Instead, his government purchased more than 900 modern construction machines, trained thousands of local young men, and put them to work paving roads with their own hands. The results were immediate. Food reached the markets faster. Children reached schools without walking through mud. Doctors reached villages once cut off by broken paths. Step by step, brick by brick, Burkina Faso began to rise. To support farmers, Traoré launched programs to provide subsidized tractors, fertilizer, and high-quality seeds. But his vision went further. Instead of chasing profits through cash crops for export, the government prioritized food security first. Rice, vegetables, fish, meat, the essentials every family needed to live with dignity. He was building a country not on foreign aid, not on empty promises, but on the solid ground of self-reliance. For Ibrahim Traoré, nation building was never about statistics on paper or glossy reports for international donors. It was about something far more tangible, whether the weakest, poorest, and most forgotten citizens could feel change in their daily lives. He often said, if a child cannot go to school, if a mother cannot get medicine, then every road, every factory, every speech is nothing but an empty shell. Those words became the heartbeat of his leadership. In rural Burkina Faso, healthcare used to be a distant dream. Some villages lay miles away from the nearest doctor. Mothers walked entire days on dusty roads just to find medicine for their children. Some families had never even seen an ultrasound machine. Traoré made it his mission to close this gap. He launched fleets of mobile health clinics, vans and trucks equipped with modern medical equipment, traveling directly into the most remote communities. These vehicles carried not just doctors and nurses, but dignity. They brought vaccines, ultrasound machines, basic surgeries, and emergency medicine to people who had been abandoned for generations. For the first time, villagers saw healthcare as a right, not a privilege. A mother no longer had to bury a child because help was too far away. A newborn could be vaccinated without delay. To many, those clinics were not just medical units. They were lifelines of hope. Education was the next frontier. Burkina Faso had lost an entire generation of children to instability, poverty, and war. Orphans of conflict roamed the streets with no future to cling to. Traoré could not accept that. He established boarding schools for the children of fallen soldiers, where orphans received not only food and shelter, but education, mentorship, and psychological support. These schools were more than classrooms. They were sanctuaries, places where children once destined to wander could dream again. Traoré also invested in rural education. New classrooms trained teachers, and free textbooks reached communities that had long been forgotten. He believed that every child, whether from a city or a small farming village, had the right to learn. But perhaps one of his most revolutionary moves came in the area most neglected by past governments: the rights of women. For centuries, widows married in traditional ceremonies were invisible in the eyes of the law. They had no inheritance rights, no legal recognition, and no safety net. When their husbands died, they were left with nothing: no land, no protection, no means to survive. Traoré changed this. He reformed national laws to recognize traditional marriages and guarantee women their rights. Widows now had legal standing, inheritance rights, and access to state support. But he didn't stop there. Understanding that empowering women meant empowering families, he launched special funds for female entrepreneurs. From small food stalls to soap-making workshops, from tailoring shops to local bakeries, women received low-interest loans, training, and guaranteed buyers for their products. The idea was simple but powerful. When a woman stands on her own feet, she lifts her entire family with her. And Traoré didn't just give money. His government provided mentoring, market access, and state contracts. Women's cooperatives were hired to supply uniforms for schools, food for hospitals, and materials for public projects. The government was not just handing out aid, it was creating sustainable opportunities. Bit by bit, village by village, family by family, a new Burkina Faso was taking shape. Children could go to school, mothers could receive health care without selling their last goat. Women could dream of businesses without fear of collapse. This was not charity, it was justice. It was dignity. It was the rebirth of a nation built not on speeches, but on lives transformed. For many presidents, security is a matter of tanks, weapons, and televised press conferences. But for Ibrahim Traoré, security began with something much simpler and far more profound: trust. He believed that if the people of Burkina Faso no longer trusted their state to protect them, then every other achievement, roads, schools, factories, could collapse overnight. And trust in Burkina Faso had been deeply wounded. For years, vast stretches of the country had been carved away by violence. Villages were abandoned. Farmers left their fields untended. Children stopped attending school because traveling to class meant risking their lives. In some areas, government authority barely existed at all. When Traoré assumed power, he didn't make empty promises of quick miracles. He admitted the truth: the road back would be long and brutal. But he also made it clear: Burkina Faso would no longer wait helplessly for foreign armies to deliver safety. Instead, he began rebuilding security from the inside out. A new military vision first, he overhauled the defense forces. Instead of relying on scattered, outdated methods, he prioritized accurate field intelligence. The army invested in drones, surveillance technology, advanced mapping systems, and early warning networks. With information, they no longer had to react after disaster struck. They could prevent it before it spread. But technology alone was not enough. Traoré launched massive training programs for young recruits, turning them not just into soldiers, but into protectors of their communities. He emphasized mobility, discipline, and cooperation with civilians. The message was clear: a Burkinabe soldier was not just a man with a gun, he was a shield for his people. Bringing the state back to the people, convoys of technicians, engineers, and medics began to accompany security patrols into areas once abandoned. Roads were reopened, water wells were repaired, schools were restaffed. Step by step, the presence of the state returned, not as a distant authority, but as a neighbor. And something remarkable happened. Families who had fled began to return. Markets reopened. The sound of drums and festivals returned to villages that had been silent for years. Without an official decree, people knew Burkina Faso was reclaiming itself. Regional solidarity. But Traoré knew security could not be limited to his own borders. The instability of the Sahel was a shared crisis. So he reached out to Mali, Niger, and Guinea, not with desperation, but with partnership. Together, these nations formed new regional defense alliances, sharing intelligence and coordinating border protection. For the first time in decades, West African leaders were saying, We will defend ourselves. We will secure our future together. It was more than a strategy. It was a shift in mindset. No longer waiting for outsiders to rescue them, Sahel nations were rewriting the rules of survival. From fear to confidence. Slowly, the psychology of the nation changed. Where once people whispered about danger, they now spoke about rebuilding. Where once they doubted their government, they now marched proudly with their flag. Security, under Traoré, became more than guns and checkpoints. It became the feeling of walking down a road without fear. It became the joy of sending your child to school and expecting them to come home. It became the ability to plan for tomorrow because today was no longer under siege. Burkina Faso was not yet free from threats, but it was no longer paralyzed by them. And that was the true victory, not just resisting enemies, but restoring the courage to live. For Ibrahim Traoré, freedom was not just about breaking chains. It was about building foundations, concrete, steel, and dreams laid into the soil of Burkina Faso. He understood a hard truth. Speeches can inspire, but only railroads, factories, and homes can keep hope alive. The Iron Road of Unity. One of his first ambitious projects was the Burkina Faso National Railway. For decades, the country's provinces were like isolated islands, cut off from one another, struggling to transport goods across broken roads. Farmers in the north had no way to bring their harvest south. Traders in the west could not reach the east without days of hardship. Traoré wanted to change that. The railway would connect every provincial capital, weaving the nation together like never before. But he didn't want a system owned by foreign contractors or built only to export resources abroad. So his government invested in domestic industry, a local train assembly plant, steel processing facilities, and workshops for track maintenance. From design to production, Burkina Faso's railway would be made by Burkinabe hands. For the first time, the dream was not just to move goods, but to move people, to move ideas, to move the soul of a nation toward unity. The pharmaceutical revolution. Another battlefield Traoré saw clearly was healthcare. For too long, Africans had been dependent on imported medicine, expensive, unstable, and often unavailable when crises struck. So he launched the construction of a national pharmaceutical park. This was not just a factory, but an entire industrial complex designed to produce essential medicines, antibiotics, vaccines, and basic drugs for millions of West Africans. His vision was bold. Burkina Faso would no longer wait for shipments from Europe or Asia to save its sick. It would produce medicine at home, not just for itself, but for its neighbors in the Sahel. This was not only about pills and bottles. It was about dignity. It was about telling every Burkinabe mother that her child's life did not depend on the goodwill of foreign companies. Factories for the people. But Traoré's industrial vision reached further still. He focused on industries that used local resources and created mass employment, textile factories that turned Burkinabe cotton into clothes, agro-processing plants that transformed local harvests into food products for the domestic market, metal workshops that produced tools, construction materials, and everyday goods. His logic was simple. Why beg for jobs when you can create them yourself? Why wait for multinationals to arrive when your own people can build industries with government support? Housing for a growing nation. He also tackled another silent crisis, housing. The old model, scattered low-rise housing projects, was wasting land and failing to meet urban needs. With population growth accelerating, Traoré pushed for high-rise social housing blocks, built in clusters with schools, clinics, and markets integrated into the design. In Ouagadougou and other cities, new apartment towers began to rise, not as sterile monuments, but as vibrant communities. For the first time, working families had access to dignified homes with running water, electricity, and public services within walking distance. Building with Burkinabe hands. What made all of this extraordinary was not just the projects themselves, it was the philosophy behind them. Traoré refused to see his people as passive recipients of foreign aid. He saw them as builders, engineers, and creators. Instead of outsourcing, he insisted on training local workers, investing in local cooperatives, and guaranteeing government purchases of domestic products. Soap factories supplied the army. Local farmers supplied the hospitals. Textile cooperatives produced uniforms for schools. Every Burkinabe citizen was invited to be part of the reconstruction. Step by step, Burkina Faso was no longer a marketplace for foreign companies. It was becoming a workshop for its own future. The spirit of reconstruction, the sound of hammers, the clang of steel, the hum of machines, they were no longer just noises. They were the heartbeat of a nation being rebuilt by its own willpower. To many outsiders, Burkina Faso was too small, too poor, too fragile to attempt such transformations, but Traoré proved them wrong. He showed that sovereignty is not an abstract idea. It is a factory. It is a railroad. It is a home built for a family that once lived in mud huts. And as the first trains prepared to roll, as the first medicines came off the production lines, as the first families moved into their new apartments, a quiet but powerful message spread across Africa. If Burkina Faso can do it, so can we. Some leaders inspire with wealth, some with fear, and some with power. But Ibrahim Traoré inspired with something far rarer, humility. When he assumed the presidency, he was offered the privileges that came with the office. A salary dozens of times higher than the average citizen, a lifestyle fit for elites. Yet he refused. He chose to live on the same monthly pay he had earned as a captain in the army, just $583 a month. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a daily reminder to himself and to his people that leadership is service, not privilege. While presidents across the world built palaces and hid fortunes, Traoré lived simply, eating the same food as his soldiers, walking the same dirt roads as farmers, and speaking to people in their local languages without bodyguards forming walls around him. The soldier president. When he traveled to the Russia-Africa Summit in 2023, the contrast was striking. While many heads of state wore tailored suits and silk ties, Traoré walked in wearing his combat fatigues, his red beret perched firmly, tactical gloves on his hands. He didn't look like a politician. He looked like a protector. And when he spoke, the world fell silent. He didn't use long, complicated sentences. He didn't drown the audience in diplomatic jargon. He said what everyone already knew, but few had the courage to admit. Africa cannot continue as puppets on strings. If we have any dignity left, we must stand up. The words echoed across the summit hall. They spread like wildfire across social media. And in that moment, a young captain from Burkina Faso became more than a national leader. He became a continental symbol, a symbol for a generation across Africa. Young people looked at him and saw themselves. Not a distant politician, not a foreign-trained economist, but someone who came from a small town, who grew up in poverty, who chose service over comfort, and who refused to bow. He became a mirror for a generation that had long been told their only hope was to migrate, to serve, or to wait for aid. In him, they saw proof that courage and integrity could be enough to rewrite a nation's destiny. More than Burkina Faso, what Traoré did inside Burkina Faso was historic. But what he symbolized outside of it was revolutionary. People began to whisper, if a country as small as Burkina Faso can rise, why not Mali? Why not Niger? Why not the Congo? Suddenly, across the Sahel, young leaders and movements were drawing inspiration from his defiance. They were not copying every policy, but they were learning the lesson he embodied. Africa's chains were not unbreakable. Humility as strength. What made this transformation so powerful was that Traoré did not present himself as a savior. He admitted mistakes, acknowledged difficulties, and never promised paradise. Instead, he promised effort, honesty, and dignity, and people respected him more for it. When he walked through rural villages unannounced, eating simple meals with farmers, his presence felt less like that of a president and more like that of an older brother. When he met with soldiers at remote outposts, he didn't just inspect them, he listened to them. That humility became his greatest strength. In a world where power is often measured by how far leaders distance themselves from their people, Traoré did the opposite. He drew closer. Awakening a continent. By 2024, he was no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He was being called the voice of a new Africa. His speeches circulated in universities, in villages, and on phones across the diaspora. His face, framed by a red beret, became a symbol painted on murals and carried on flags. Not because he was perfect, but because he was willing to be real. And in a continent long treated as a playground for others, that honesty lit a fire. The fire of self-respect, the fire of sovereignty, the fire of Africa, finally standing tall. When Ibrahim Traoré first took power, critics whispered that Burkina Faso was too small, too fragile, too poor to make a difference. But within just 2 years, his actions sent shockwaves far beyond his borders. The spark of the Sahel. Mali watched, Niger watched, Guinea listened closely, and soon they began to follow. Not by copying every policy, but by embracing the same spirit. Africa belongs to Africans. The idea spread across the Sahel like dry grass catching fire. These nations, often dismissed as weak, began to stand taller, coordinating their economies, strengthening their militaries, and refusing to be dictated to by outsiders. From Bamako to Niamey, from Conakry to Ouagadougou, the same chant began to rise: sovereignty, dignity, independence. The courage to resist it wasn't easy. The pressure from outside powers grew intense. Sanctions, threats, diplomatic isolation, tools of coercion sharpened against them. But Traoré and his allies didn't fold. They endured. Why? Because for the first time, they believed they weren't alone. Each nation's courage fed the other's resolve. What once seemed unthinkable, standing up to the West, was now happening in unison. And it wasn't just governments. Ordinary citizens across Africa began demanding the same from their leaders. Stop exporting raw wealth for pennies. Stop bowing to foreign armies. Start building industries for our people. Traoré's Burkina Faso had become living proof that these demands were not fantasy, they were possible. A new model of development. What emerged was a new model for Africa, one that contrasted sharply with the old system of dependency. Instead of chasing foreign loans that came with strings attached, Burkina Faso invested in domestic production. Instead of letting multinationals strip the land, it built refineries, factories, and farms to keep value at home. Instead of tolerating foreign military bases, it built alliances with neighbors and trained its own people. This was not just a policy change, it was a paradigm shift. For decades, Africa had been told it could only develop by following the blueprints of others, plans written in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. Traoré tore those blueprints in half and wrote a new one, drawn in Burkinabe dust and inked in African sweat. The fire spreads beyond the Sahel. The ripple did not stop in West Africa. Across the continent, young Africans began quoting Traoré's speeches. In Nairobi, students debated his model of sovereignty. In Johannesburg, activists painted murals of him with words like, "Africa will rise." In the diaspora, from Paris to New York, Africans abroad found themselves inspired by a leader they had once never heard of. The African Union, once often accused of being toothless, now faced pressure from within to listen to these new voices. A quiet revolution was underway, not led by boardrooms or billionaires, but by people demanding dignity. The challenge ahead. Still, no one pretended the road would be easy. The powers that had benefited from Africa's dependency were not about to let go without a fight. Economic pressure, political meddling, even destabilization, all remained threats on the horizon. But something had already changed. Burkina Faso proved that even a small country, with the right leadership, could ignite a continental movement. It proved that sovereignty was not an illusion. It proved that the dream of a free Africa could be more than words. And at the center of it all was a young soldier, barely in his mid-30s, wearing a red beret, refusing to bow, daring to say what no one else would. Africa does not need saving. Africa needs the right to save itself. The wave had begun, and it would not be stopped. The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not a fairy tale. It is not a miracle. It is the story of what happens when honesty, courage, and integrity collide with a history of exploitation. In the heart of West Africa, in a country the world once overlooked, a young soldier reminded his people and the world that sovereignty is not gifted. It is earned, defended, and built with sweat. More than a president, Traoré never claimed to be a savior. He never promised paradise. What he promised was something both humbler and far greater, the chance for Burkina Faso to stand on its own feet. He chose not to enrich himself, but to live as his soldiers did. He chose not to depend on others, but to build with his people's hands. He chose not to repeat the language of dependency, but to forge a new vocabulary: self-reliance, dignity, sovereignty. And for that, millions across Africa now see him not just as the president of Burkina Faso, but as the face of a generation. The model for a continent, from the gold refinery in Ouagadougou to the mobile health clinics crossing remote villages, from the tomato factories to the national railway, from the laws that protect widows to the classrooms filled with orphans of war. Every action told the same story. Africa's future cannot be outsourced. It must be built at home. Burkina Faso's journey is not perfect. It is not without setbacks, challenges, or pain. But in every road paved, every child vaccinated, every woman empowered, there is proof that change does not require waiting for permission. It requires starting, here, now, with what you have. The symbolic payoff symbols matter, and Traoré's symbolism has been as powerful as his policies. The red beret, the soldiers' fatigues, the refusal of luxury, the speeches stripped of flowery rhetoric, replaced by raw truth. In him, people see the return of something Africa had long been denied: leaders who live as part of their people, not above them. When he stood before the world and declared that Africa would no longer be a puppet, he wasn't just speaking for Burkina Faso. He was voicing centuries of frustration and centuries of hope. And in that moment, the chains of silence snapped. The road ahead. The question now is not whether Traoré can transform Burkina Faso alone. The question is whether his example can awaken the rest of Africa. Because the lesson of his leadership is clear. A small nation can defy giants. A poor country can still invest in itself. A humble leader can inspire millions more than a wealthy one. If Burkina Faso, with limited means, can reclaim its dignity, then any nation can. The morale. At the end of the day, the legacy of Ibrahim Traoré will not be measured only in railroads built or factories open. It will be measured in something deeper: the restoration of faith. Faith that Africa's story is not written in foreign capitals. Faith that ordinary people, with extraordinary will, can change history. Faith that sovereignty is not a dream, but a duty. As an old African proverb says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Burkina Faso no longer walks alone. And because of that, Africa has begun its long walk toward freedom, together.